right, Erin, you are good to introduce our speaker whenever you're ready. I am starting the recording.
Hey everyone, I'm Erin Murray. I'm also with Project Awaken, and we are so excited to be here for this event tonight. We have Amanda Rosenberger with us. Although she works at Tech, she's not here as a representative of Tech. She's here as a volunteer for Moms Demand Action. And she's very involved in that organization, which she will tell you more about. And she's also been trained as a survivor fellow for Everytown for Gun Safety. She's an amazing speaker, and she has some amazing things to speak to us about tonight. And at the end, we will open it up for some questions if anybody wants to keep track of some questions they have as we go through. And I'm going to turn it over to Amanda.
Hi, everyone. Jack, when you have a moment, if you could enable screen sharing so that I can share my PowerPoint. Thank you. So like Erin said, my name is Amanda Rosenberger. I do work at Tennessee Tech in the biology department, but I'm here to represent Moms Demand Action and Everytown for Gun Sense in America. I am a gun violence survivor. I survived a school shooting in 1992, and I've been volunteering with Moms Demand Action for about 3 years. And I just wanted to give you guys some information today. It's going to start with just sort of talking about the intersection between gun violence and domestic violence, and really try to give you guys some action items, some things that you guys can keep in mind and take away from this program tonight to give you some ideas of how we can move forward as a nation to end gun violence in the United States, at least reduce gun violence in the United States. All right, so like Jack mentioned, it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month in October, and we know that gun-related domestic violence is a deadly crisis that's facing families in the U.S. And largely due to particularly in the United States, weak gun laws that make it easy for domestic abusers to gain access to firearms. So my name is Amanda Rosenberger. I've been working for Moms Demand Action for 3 years, but I've been a gun violence survivor since 1992. When I was 18 years old, a shooter entered my campus at night and on a snowy winter evening shot at anything that moved. We were very lucky that the firearm that he purchased was Chinese made and very cheap, and his gun kept jamming. And it was only because of that that we lost only 2 people that evening. We lost my friend Galen, who is a dear friend, and a student at the college, and I lost a professor, Nyakunyan Sayez, who was my language and writing teacher. And I work today with Moms Demand Action, and I share my story as often as I can to try to raise awareness, put a human face on the gun violence epidemic in the United States, and also just to try to prevent these sorts of things from happening to everyone else. So I do that as an Everytown Survivor Fellow. But we're going to talk specifically about domestic violence today. One of the things that we know for sure is that domestic violence and gun violence are deeply interconnected. It impacts lots of families and communities across the US. And why is that? Guns, in a sense, we talked about how power dynamics are really a big part of abuse. And guns exacerbate the power and control dynamic used by abusers to inflict emotional abuse and exert coercive control over their victims, even when abusers do not pull the trigger. And very often they do pull that trigger. But here's an example of a survivor that I'll share with you. If it works. There it goes.
Laura Morris. I'm from Washington, D.C. My first husband, my ex-husband, shot me in 1981. It was after years and years of escalating abuse. He started threatening me with a gun that he bought in a bar for $25. For years, I didn't want anyone to know this had happened to me. Domestic abuse is a very isolating situation. I mean, that's the goal of your abuser, is to keep you isolated from your family and friends. And as hard as this is to tell this story over and over again, if one person doesn't have to go through what I went through, then all of this will be worthwhile.
So it's important as survivors that we understand this intersection. I'm sorry to say that nearly 1 million women alive today have been reported being shot or shot at by an intimate partner. In an average month, 52 American women are shot to death by an intimate partner. And in abuse situations, we see that the presence of a gun can really escalate the threat very quickly. We have about 4.5 million women in the United States have been reported being threatened with a gun at some point in their life. And we have to keep in mind that the guns in the hands of an abuser, whether they're men or women, extend far beyond the intimate relationship. Naturally, this affects children, family members, co-workers, and causes long-standing health problems. And we know that access to a gun is one of the biggest risks that we have in domestic violence situations. It makes it 5 times more likely that an abusive partner will kill his female victim. So guns are a very important factor in the in the domestic abuse conversation. And of course, like many issues we see in the United States, it is exacerbated in minority and marginalized populations. For example, more than half of American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced physical violence by intimate partners in their lifetime, and they're much more likely to be killed by a firearm than their white counterparts. And sadly, there's no research to support the notion that owning a gun increases safety for women. So women are often left without a lot of resources, domestic resources, to protect themselves in these situations. So just to go into what we can do about this, and I think it's really important to understand that a lot of this impact of gun violence on American life, a lot of people see as an inevitable fact that we are an armed populace. But we do have legislative solutions in place that we know can be effective to reduce, if not eliminate, gun violence against women in a domestic violence situation, or gun violence against men as well. There are things that we can do to prohibit people with dangerous histories from having guns. And we know that in dangerous histories almost always include some form of domestic violence. And we do that by having background checks on all gun sales and by closing what we call the Charleston loophole. The Charleston loophole is how the Charleston shooter was able to obtain his firearm. He would have actually failed his background check, but because it took more than 3 days for that background check to go through, he was able to go ahead and purchase the firearm. And it also, a big legislative solution that we bring in is to require people who are convicted domestic abusers and people with restraining orders against them to at least temporarily surrender their guns. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening in Tennessee. From 2014 to 2018, 134 women were fatally shot by an intimate partner in Tennessee. And this represents a large portion of intimate partner gun homicides in the state. That's 79%. So we see that's a big cause of gun violence in this state. From 2014 to 2018, 3,191 women were fatally shot by an intimate partner in the United States. So we can see that we are high up on that list. Again, this represents almost about 80% of intimate partner gun homicides. So we follow that statistic quite well. And again, nearly 1 million women alive today have been reported being shot or shot at by an intimate partner. So what laws do we have in place in Tennessee that might help protect victims of domestic violence? We do not have universal background checks, and this is probably one of the most important pieces of legislation that we do not have in the state of Tennessee that would protect our citizens from people with dangerous histories obtaining firearms. We do have prohibition for dating partners under restraining orders. So if someone does try to purchase a firearm at a gun store where they do background checks, they would be prohibited from doing so. Unfortunately, it's very easy for domestic abusers to skirt these prohibitions by shopping for firearms online or at a gun show. We have closed the Charleston loophole in Tennessee. We do ask that convicted domestic abusers relinquish their firearms, also convicted dating partners. But dating partners that are under restraining orders because of a history of violence are not required to relinquish their firearms in Tennessee. So we still have some work to do. We do know that COVID-19 has intensified the factors that contribute to our domestic violence crisis and our gun-related domestic violence crisis. We know that firearm sales have gone up as a result of COVID-19. We do see lots of peaks and valleys in firearm sales, and often in relation to what's going on in the larger world. We're seeing even more firearm purchasing going on with COVID-19 than we did after the shooting at Sandy Hook, for example. And then you have that other factor coming in there. We have gun sales that have gone up, personal finances have become strained for a lot of people, which can cause a lot of stress. And victims are trapped indoors with their abusers. And so we have ready access to guns, and we have all those factors that increase the lethality for victims and their children. So this problem is current, and it's at crisis levels in our nation. We do know that there has been a large increase in calls to domestic violence hotlines and police departments during the pandemic, including here in Tennessee, where we have seen an increase of 55% in the number of domestic violence calls. So those are some of the facts. I have more of them here to share with you guys as we go forward. I'd like to have a nice discussion this evening where we can talk about all of these things. But I do want to arm you with, excuse the term, but I want to arm you with some information. The first thing is know how to protect yourself. Know the facts. Know your resources. Know what's available to you. There are ways for us to advocate for laws that protect victims and their children. We can ensure support services for victims and their children, both at the legislative and at the local community action level. And I think it's also very important for people to understand that gun ownership, although it is an important part of our history, it's an important part of our culture, it does create a lethality in situations where domestic violence is an issue. And domestic violence can be the primary predictor of violence in the future, and the lethality of guns make that intersection extremely important to understand. Naturally, of course, if you are experiencing or you know someone who is experiencing intimate partner violence, we always encourage you to call the domestic violence hotline at 1-800-799-7233. And you can find any kind of resources on legal assistance at womenslaw.org. And I'll try to make these slides available to you guys so you can access all these numbers and all this information. I also think it's really important for us to do whatever we can to support national and local organizations that provide shelter for women and safe places for women to be in domestic violence situations. We have wonderful national organizations that have partnered with every town on trying to understand the nexus between gun violence and domestic violence. There's, of course, the National Domestic Violence Hotline that I just mentioned. There's a National Network to End Domestic Violence and the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. All of these organizations take donations and they take volunteers as well, and you are welcome to work with them. In Nashville, we have a wonderful organization called the Mary Parrish Center that understands that homelessness and domestic violence are intertwined issues as well. And I'll share a short video about the Mary Parrish Center.
Hi, my name is Summer Sabi, and I am connected to Mary Parish because I lived here. I always said it would be different if it was just myself, but I had two little ones to think about. My biggest fear was homelessness. I didn't want to be homeless with my kids. That is what kept me in a very abusive relationship. The biggest thing that I do remember is coming here. And I remember coming in and everyone greeting me in my apartment. It felt like home. And I was so relieved and felt like this just huge burden had been lifted of where am I going with my children? Where are they going to sleep? I stayed for a little over a year and was able to get really good employment and move on. The difference from 4 years ago to today, I was a resident here. I lived here, my children lived here. Today, our entire family has completely turned around. We are stable. I am stable. I have a wonderful job. We're in a house of our own. We all have our own bedrooms, a puppy, and a fenced-in backyard. And I'm honored to help the next mom that comes in with her kids is going to walk in and probably have that same feeling that I did. When you're in an abusive relationship, you feel like there are two options, to either stay or to be homeless. Mary Parish will give you a third option, and that's hope. My name is Summer Sabi. I'm a survivor of domestic violence and a former resident at the Mary Parish Center. And now 4 years later, I'm serving on the board at the Mary Parish Center.
I would like to note about the Mary Parish Center and also our local Cookeville resources that they help both men and women and transgender people with any domestic violence situation. They have no limits on that, although it may seem it's biased towards women. It just reflects that most of their clients are women, but they are willing to help anyone who needs their help for domestic violence situations. And men are not immune, and transgender people certainly are not either. So our Cookeville resources are Genesis House and the Family Justice Center. I have two websites here that you can look at for local opportunities to volunteer or donate if you'd like to partner up with these organizations here. Having a shelter is extremely important for preventing a loss of life in a domestic violence situation, and that's what we're really working for here. And finally, I think it's really important to talk about legislative efforts in Tennessee. Keep in mind that with any gun violence issue or any domestic violence issue, there's usually a combination of personal responsibility, legislative responsibility, and local community level responsibility that all must intersect to really make a dent on gun violence issues. In a sense, we have made great strides in terms of legislation in Tennessee, but there's so much more work we can do there. Tennessee has this interesting mix of weak and strong gun laws. There are some laws that are really excellent and very forward thinking, and others that are quite weak that tend to undermine the stronger gun laws. For example, Tennessee has improved their gun laws by narrowing the Charleston loophole, but we still have the gun show and internet sales loophole. We try to give law enforcement enough time to conduct background checks. We try to let law enforcement know when someone fails a background check. We've also tried to close dangerous loopholes that allowed domestic abusers to buy guns if those domestic abusers were not married to their victim. So we've closed the boyfriend loopholes. Despite these efforts and despite these improvements, the Tennessee legislature continues to introduce harmful legislation. This includes permitless carry, guns on campus, and expansion of the stand your ground law that's already in Tennessee. We would really like to see universal background checks. We'd like to close that one more boyfriend loophole that still exists in the laws. And we want to support resource for firearm relinquishment when that is indicated. So there's a lot more work to be done here in Tennessee. And we start that work in January when the legislation opens, and we welcome your involvement. We know that background checks work. Since the introduction of the FBI's background check system in 1998, nearly 400,000 firearm sales to domestic abusers were blocked. And can imagine how many people also with criminal background histories had their firearm purchases blocked too. And finally, I want to invite you guys to join the movement for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, either as a Students Demand Action group. You can join Students Demand Action. You do not have to be a mom to join. It is what we call mom-centered, but it is certainly not mom exclusive. If you text HONOR to 64433, then you will join the movement and you will get texts about things that you can do and concrete actions that you can take to improve gun sense in America and hopefully alleviate some of the situation we're talking about here. Okay, so I have a whole lot of facts and figures and things that I can talk to you guys about. I can share my own history with you guys with gun sense legislative action, with Moms Demand Action, Students Demand Action in every town for gun safety. And I'd just like to open it up for any questions y'all may have. Thank you so much.
I had a question.
Yes, Jamie.
You did mention some local resources, but I specifically was wondering what, if we're interested, what we could be doing locally to help out with gun violence in the home.
Well, one of the main things you can do in terms of domestic violence is to work with the Genesis House and work with those groups, those local groups on organizations on campus. I suggest that each of you have the domestic violence hotline on your phones. Be ready to share it with people that might have a story to tell you. Have it available to you all the time. I have that and the suicide prevention hotline on my phone at all times. And when you about 2/3 of American deaths from guns is actually from suicide. And we also know that mass shootings is often connected to domestic violence, and mass shootings are often a domestic situation that often ends in suicide on part of the individual committing that act. So suicidal and homicidal use of guns in these sort of volatile situations can be particularly lethal. And so it's good to have awareness of those resources right at your fingertips and available to you to help anyone who might be in crisis. So, and also there's just tons of volunteer opportunities with domestic violence shelters. When I was a college student, I actually volunteered as a hotline, Amanda hotline, had to do a lot of training. And that was a really good thing, a really good experience for me. And I also babysat kids. As you can imagine, childcare is a big issue, as well as homelessness is a big issue for a lot of people that are experiencing domestic violence issues. If I had my druthers, I think one of the things I would have done more of at the time, and it shows the advances that we've made in our culture, I would have worked more with queer and transgender folks that are experiencing domestic violence issues and stalking issues, and we would have had more resources for men. And now I really see a big difference in how both of those things are handled right now than when I was doing it. So I'm really excited that we have better resources.
Well,
Amanda, I've got a question.
It was really good. Sorry.
Go ahead, Jamie, you finish.
Oh, I was just saying, thanks. Adding the numbers into the phone, I thought that was a really good idea. I'll do that.
Okay, so I can't tell you how many times I've heard women say, oh, no one would ever touch me because I'd shoot them, right? And I'm wondering how you respond when somebody says something like that.
Well, the first thing I do is I say, where is your firearm? How do you keep it in your home? I think it's very, very important that if you use a firearm for self-defense, that you secure it so that you are truly the only person who has access to it. And a lot of domestic abusers that obtain firearms, not through purchase, they will steal it from a relative. They will often take it from the person who owns that gun, right? So if you have proper and customized security for your gun, then by all means, I think that's a really good way to try to protect yourself. More often than not, though, gun ownership is actually increases the risk that the person who owns the gun will be shot by that gun, and that's just statistics. That's not, but there's a lot of things that you can do personally in terms of personal responsibility, in terms of storage and training, that might reduce that chance a little bit. Unfortunately, we're not really in a position to say much about the statistics of that because we are prohibited from doing a lot of research on gun violence. And so we hope that these educational initiatives like safe storage and customized storage and things like that, it makes sense that that would improve the safety of the woman in that situation. And there's training and stuff available for that, but we don't have the data to show that that's the case. We do have data to show that firearm ownership by a woman actually increases her chance of suffering from gun homicide or gun violence. But again, a lot of that might be due to individual choices that are made in terms of how that gun is stored and how it is used. I often say to myself, I think guns are a really good offensive weapon. They're not really that great of a defensive weapon. One of my favorite people in the world managed to defend herself from a gun from a giant book, you know. So sometimes, you know, the things that we do to keep ourselves safe can include firearms, and I understand why people make those choices, but there's usually lots of different choices that a woman can make to protect herself that don't involve firearms if there's any concern about the security of that firearm in the domestic situation.
Thank you. I really appreciate those answers. I think they're great because I think about, you know, I just want to be like, well, no, you wouldn't. But obviously that's not a good like response to.
No, and I do want to make it clear that Moms Demand Action and Every Town for Gun Safety, we may have a rep, but we're not anti-firearm ownership. In fact, if you're a law-abiding citizen, none of the things that we proposed, none of the legislative actions that we're working for, none of that is anti-firearm owners, responsible ownership. I love responsible gun owners. I want there to be responsible gun owners, and I'd like to see greater education and research on how we can own our firearms in the safest way possible. We do know that, however, that domestic abuse and domestic violence and gun ownership are a lethal combination. And we should be able to take action as a community and as a country to try to prevent the deaths of our neighbors and our brothers and sisters.
Thank you so much. Amanda, would you be willing to talk more about the boyfriend loophole? I know some folks don't know what that means.
Yeah, it's one of those archaic bits of legislation that needed to change, where a lot of the prohibitions wasn't considered a domestic violence or domestic abuse situation unless there was an official marriage involved. So obviously, in the days before gay marriage was legal, that meant a lot of committed couples that were in abusive relationships were left out of this. And so you could have a long history of abuse for girlfriends or partners, other types of partners, and not be covered under that law. So there have been laws put into place to prevent that now, that any sort of partner abuse is covered as if you have been convicted of that partner abuse, if you have a long-term restraining order in place, which means you have due process, you are asked to relinquish your firearms. One of the big problems is that you are asked to relinquish your firearms. And so there's often not follow-up to this. And it really is dependent on the judge and the judge's behavior to see if that is followed through. So it's a great idea that if someone has a history of domestic violence, that they not be permitted to purchase firearms, or they must relinquish their firearms. It's pretty easy to forbid purchase of firearms where background checks are taking place, but it's not always the case that someone relinquishes their firearms. And again, if people aren't storing their firearms safely, they can also try to obtain it another way. But we do know that where those loopholes are closed, where domestic abusers are prevented from purchasing firearms, and where those universal backgrounds are in place, we see a reduction of 30%, which is very significant, in domestic homicides. That is a significant amount. It's a significant reduction. Like I said, there's just no way that legislation alone can prevent all gun homicides and gun suicides, but there are things that we can do and that we can put into place to reduce them dramatically at a legislative level. The other legislation we can do is called red flag laws. We have been trying to push red flag laws in Tennessee. Red flag laws are when someone shows disturbing behavior, makes threats, does different things, like the Parkland shooter, for example, that we can then, with due process, put them on a list to be forbidden from purchasing firearms. Again, it's that background check that is so essential to make sure that we keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people.
So that leads me to ask a question about, is there currently a system federally, statewide, or locally that requires gun dealers to notify local law enforcement, which would even include like TTU police, when a convicted domestic violent abuser or stalker fails a background check?
Yes, there is a law in place, and that was actually put in place 2 years ago. So we were very excited. That was a win on our part. So if someone who's forbidden from purchasing a firearm fails a background check, local law enforcement are alerted. TTU police are not part of that, but the Cookeville police would be alerted. So I did call the TTU police today and get a little bit of information from them on how they handle guns on campus, because guns are allowed on campus in Tennessee, and how that is handled. And it's largely handled through the permit system, which is tied to the background check system. So it's a little bit secondary how TTU handles it, but our local law enforcement should be alerted if someone in our community tries to purchase a firearm and is forbidden from doing so, according to the background check system. But like I said, until gun shows and internet sales are included in those background checks, we are vulnerable.
Thank you.
I have a kind of a follow-up to that. This question made me think about how domestic violence situations are some of the most lethal situations for police to respond to.
Yes.
And it made me think about, another kind of potential, like other people who carry the fallout for the lethality of domestic violence and, gun violence, and how those things go together. It seems to me like police would also be in favor of restricting some of this stuff if it meant that they had less risk when they needed to respond to stuff like this, both for themselves and the people they were responding to.
Yes, a lot of our legislative action, we find that we're partnering very, very closely with police organizations, and they are speaking in favor of it as well. So we have often joined together in a lot of our initiatives to try to provide them with more tools to prevent domestic abusers from obtaining access to firearms. So it's not unusual for police organizations and Moms Demand Action to be standing side by side and asking for legislative action. One of the things that we'd really like to see done is more resources devoted to people who need to go to potential volatile and potential dangerous situations to enforce a relinquishment order from a judge. Right now, it's kind of a little bit too up to the local community to follow those orders through, and there's not a lot of study. One of the things that I would love our legal students to look into is how good are our local judges at following up with questions about firearm relinquishment in the case of domestic violence situations in our own courts. I don't know if there's anybody who's keeping an eye on that here. I know that around Nashville, they're doing a really, really good job, but that's all I know.
I had a question. So are there like right now any gun laws in the Tennessee state legislature that would have anything to do with like guns on Tech's campus?
Yes, we have right now the guns are allowed on campus at Tennessee Tech if if people, if you're a staff or a faculty member only, so it's not allowed by students. So staff and faculty are permitted. If we have what's called an enhanced carry permit, and an enhanced carry permit requires some training and a background check. Unfortunately, last year they loosened the training requirements, so I can carry a gun on campus without ever having the experience of firing that weapon. I can just take an online course, which is very, very easy to pass, and just carry a gun on campus. So that makes me a little nervous. If someone's going to carry a lethal weapon around my kids and around my workplace, I'd like them to know what they're doing, at least a little bit. And we don't have that requirement anymore. So again, I think that the way that our campus handles gun laws, or at least how it comes down from the state legislation, really relies very strongly on the permit system and the integrity of the permit system. Unfortunately, the gun lobby has been working extremely hard. It's been their biggest legislative priority in Tennessee for the past 4 years to weaken permit requirements so that we basically become an open carry state. If that is the case, then there's nothing preventing a staff or faculty member with a criminal history to carry a firearm on campus at this point. We've also seen, over the years, we've seen a lot of proposals come through. Luckily, they haven't really gained a lot of steam in the Tennessee legislation to allow open carry on campus and concealed carry on campus by both students and faculty. We have to basically use up a lot of our bandwidth every year to fight this kind of reckless gun legislation. And the way that I always feel, I'm a professor, I don't think that fear and learning come together. And I think a lot of the carrying, a lot of people who do carry are responsible. They're responsible gun owners, but they're not necessarily going to be very useful in a defensive situation. And their chances of finding themselves in an offensive situation is a little bit high in the volatile nature of a gun, of a college campus. So I would prefer that we not have guns on campus. I think it's antithetical to the mission of the university. However, if we do have to have it and it's tied to the permit system, I'd really like our permit system to be intact and in good place and where some strong training requirements remain. So not only would I like to see the permit requirements stay put in Tennessee, but I'd like to see them go back to the way they were, that actually required someone to be on a firing range with a trained instructor to get that permit.
As another employee on campus, I could not agree more, right? Safety is important. We had a question that was sent for me to ask. And so someone would like you to talk more about, you showed us the slide about the laws in Tennessee, but they're wondering if you can kind of talk us through each of those and what it means, and particularly the ones that had the red X's, how we can help to improve that in our state.
Yes. Okay. Well, you want to go back to that slide? I love that slide. It's kind of fun because it's like our to-do list, right? And it's where we can go to get things done in Tennessee. I know that looks black. I'm going back. Come on. Whoop. Oh, it didn't like to share that slide again. All right, I'm going to get back on it and then do that. Sorry, this is a little bit of a... I think as a teacher, I'd be able to just handle this technology like seamlessly, but you know. Okay, so these are the big ones in terms of the laws that we have seen in other states that have really worked well at reducing domestic partner violence and and gun homicide. So the big ones being all the loopholes that basically connect domestic violence to legal marriage. If those are removed, so our dating partners, under restraining orders or convicted dating partners are prevented from purchasing firearms. We still see some problems with relinquishment for dating partners under restraining orders. Okay, so that's one legislative action that we need to put into place, that we consider what we consider an offensive legislative action that we can try to move for. Main thing for doing that is to find that legislation, write it up, and work with some great legislative partners to get that introduced. Every year we work for closing the gun show and internet sales background check loophole. Right now it's just voluntary. Right now you can sell a gun legally in a parking lot. And as long as that's the case, a lot of these other laws are weakened because of that. So we're really pushing towards universal background checks at both the state and the federal level. Right now there is a federal law that's up in place that's been stalled in the Senate for a really long time. So you can always give old Mitch McConnell a call and tell him to get that thing on the Senate's order of business as soon as the legislative season begins again. We are not in season for legislative action. So this is our deep breath before we get down into the trenches, starting in January. And then we're going to be working really, really hard to try to get these things pulled through. If universal background checks are passed at the federal level, then it will apply to states, and we won't need to worry about convincing the state legislature anymore. But it would be nice to have Tennessee be a leader in this, especially as a southern state.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's, by the way, it's supported by 89% of Americans. And when it didn't pass the first time, when you see legislation not pass after 90%, when 90% of Americans agree with it, and after Sandy Hook, a lot of people despaired. A lot of people said this will stay the third rail of politics forever. I still hear it now. If they're letting people kill kindergartners in schools, then and that just passes, then there's obviously no point in fighting this. And Moms Demand Action said and we have grown tremendously since then, and we have gone very far with it. So keep fighting. We will win this.
Lots of work to do, but you keep fighting and then you keep winning. Right?
Lots of work. And you try to what we call fall forward. So when things, or fail forward. So when things don't go our way, we try to, basically turn it on its head and turn it into a victory.
Love it. We have a question in the chat for you, Amanda. Okay. And it says, why is the percentage of domestic violence so high in Nashville?
In Nashville, in terms of the increased calls? I'm assuming it's because of the increase, that 55% increase in calls. I think a lot of it has to do actually with how good Mary Parish is. I think because they offer the opportunity of homes as well as an opportunity to get away from abusers, that is just a wonderful nexus that actually makes people willing to reach out for help, because they feel that they can call the cops, they can call the shelters all they want, but if they can't get away, then what are you going to do? And there's COVID, right? So I think Mary Parish is actually, that increase in calls is actually one of the side effects of their, not only the COVID situation and just nationally what's going on, but also the effectiveness of Mary Parish as an organization. I think it's a great model of how we should handle domestic violence across the nation. They're doing wonderful, wonderful work, and they've helped thousands of women and men separate from their abusers and basically restart their lives. So I think that might be why, but I don't think we really know. Like, a lot of times we just don't have the data to really show what's driving everything. We just know that the crisis is increasing and it's a problem. Yeah, I saw that 55% too, and I was just like, oh, God. You know that their waiting list has got to be miles long.
Absolutely.
So,
I have another question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, whoever that was.
Sorry. So I had a quick question about the statistics as far as men versus women. So Do you think that maybe the metrics are actually like the statistics are very like similar? It's just that because of the stigma, it keeps men from reaching out and getting help as often as women?
Yes, absolutely. I think there are some studies that show that men are not only often in abusive relationships, I think 1 in 5, and they often do not leave those abusive relationships because of the stigma associated with them. I think that's very, very clear. One of the things that they have found is that women are less likely to use firearms in their abusive situation with men. I think a lot of it may just have to do with the physical inequalities, but again, I just don't think it's very well studied. So I'd like to see more done with that. But I do know that you can just sort of think of a domestic abuse and a domestic violence situation as a crucible. It's a crucible no matter who the abuser is. Add a firearm to that crucible and the lethality of that situation goes up, whether it's male or female. And certainly the resources that we have need to be available to both men and women, since men are, they may be less likely to take the domestic abuse situation seriously. They may be less likely to feel they are physically at risk, or they might be fearful of the societal stigma of being a victim of abuse. Any number of those things might be going on. And obviously that's not my expertise, but anything that we can do to increase awareness and understanding, I think is helpful. And we certainly see situations where homicides take place when the woman is the abuser or the stalker in the situation, and they are violent against a male partner, or a male partner against a male partner. So just, in general.
Thank you. I just, my current boyfriend, he had an ex-girlfriend who held an automatic rifle to his head. So I'm familiar with the stories, and I didn't know if that was a common thing just as much among men, or if they didn't talk about it, because he never reported. And she's a police officer, by the way, today. She's a police officer. So it's crazy how like that kind of goes under the radar and how little studies there are about it.
It does indeed. And often there's so many warning signs ahead of time. You get stalking, you get abusive phone calls, you get all sorts of things that take place before it reaches that level of lethality and danger. And if people were more willing to take the step, and the resources and infrastructure was in place to respond to these situations effectively, we could save a lot of men and women's lives. There's no question in my mind that that's the case. And talking about it, he's brave to talk about it. Talk about it some more. Get it out there. Talk about those situations. We certainly, I think it's just really important to demystify the situation. It's a power dynamic. It's a power play, and guns and power are related. It's the power of life over death. These are lethal instruments that are intended to do harm. That's what they're designed to do. And so it's not surprising that they often get brought into those situations.
Yeah, I do agree. It's very important that they talk about it, especially my boyfriend actually does want to be a police officer one day. And so it's very important to talk about that kind of thing and be familiar with it. And like, he never reported. He had to leave because they were living together, leave in the middle of the night and like just up and left, and like that was it. So like it's so important to like tell people, and he's very open about it. So
absolutely. And I just remove that stigma, make resources available, all that sort of thing. Absolutely. And he's a survivor. And I think one of the things that we often need to think about as people who've experienced domestic violence or abuse or anything like this in our lives is that often when you're turning the narrative from I've experienced this, I'm a victim of this, to I'm a survivor of this, then we start moving forward, we start thinking forward, we start acting forward, and we start contributing to the national conversation on how to get rid of this issue. And I really applaud him for telling his story, because that is a big part of transitioning from victim to survivor. And when you transition from victim, where you're just saying, this happened to me, and to survivor, where you say, this happened to me and I am doing these following things to take care of myself, to take care of my community, to heal, then we start seeing our entire nation start to heal. I think that's how we get together. That's what us survivors who are involved with Moms Demand Action do. We get together and we say, all right, we can't change the past, but let's try to make this not happen to anybody else. And the first thing that we always learn how to do is to tell our stories and put our stories out there for people to listen to. Obviously, no one should do that before they're ready to do that, though. So, making that transition from victim to survivor is a very personal decision. It's a decision we make within ourselves, and you do not rush it. You do not rush it, and you take care of yourself as you go through that transition. So if anybody ever wants to talk to me about that, I'm more than happy to take the time to talk to people about that. It took me 25 years, so it takes time.
So I have another question, and it's very inspiring to hear what you just said. I am a survivor, and I'm still in the middle of rising, Phoenix rising. And through my experience in talking about it with some of my close friends, I found out something that I did not know about someone that I knew, and that he had been in a relationship where he lived with somebody, and he's a homosexual, and he was violently abused. And fortunately, his parents were there to help him get out of that situation. But as he and I were talking about it, he expressed how he was like, there was no way I could call the cops. He, living in a small town America, he felt like there was no way that he could trust that they would not look at the situation with bias or stereotyping. So he didn't feel safe, which I can understand that. I dealt with some of that in my own events. But so this leads me to ask you, that's something that has just been really like weighing on me, is that how can we, because there are more, I have a lot of friends who are in the LGBTQ community, and this is not the first time I've heard of this. This is just a very close individual to me. So how can we better help and bring awareness to these folks, like this group of people, to say, hey, we're there for you, and we're not going to let small town cops, for lack of a better word, come in and make you feel like you're not being protected? Like, what can we do for these folks?
I think there's a lot of volunteer work you could do. Okay, so I'm going to talk mostly from personal experience, not necessarily from Moms Demand Action. Though Moms Demand Action does recognize that LGBTQ community is at an increased chance of risk of homicide and suicide from firearm. So, all of our minority communities have an increased chance, some more than others, LGBTQ people as well. And we know from the Pulse shooting that also, hate crimes can be committed at a mass level against the LGBTQ community. That being said, I think that there's two things that you can think about. One is that local organizations that address domestic violence issues, it is worthwhile to ask them, to say to them, what are your programs for your LGBTQ community members? What do you have in place? Do you have volunteers that have training in an understanding of these situations? Trauma training, anti-bias training, all that sort of stuff. Those domestic violence shelters and hotlines and organizations are all working towards improving equity and equality in their situation. That's a primary mission of almost every domestic violence program that I know. And they have a unique and close bond with law enforcement. So then that close bond with law enforcement means that they can then take their priorities to law enforcement with an already built understanding and trust between each other and say, hey, how's your anti-bias training coming? Can we help you with that? Can we do a seminar for y'all? Can we tell a story about someone who was shy to call you guys? Can we do something like that? And I think it's really important to, we can do it through, the reason why I suggest doing it through the organizations is, again, these domestic violence organizations have that history with law enforcement. They trust each other. They know each other. They have a long history. So if the domestic violence shelter says, we're seeing some calls from LGBTQ people that are reluctant to call you, they'll be like, oh, that's a problem. We need to do something about that, okay? And then nobody's asked as an individual to be outed or put on the spot to tell their story if they're represented by a larger organization that already has the ear of law enforcement. So that's what I would do in that situation, is just ask the local domestic violence shelter, what do you got? Or you have anti-bias training. And the really cool thing, in the age of internet education of absolutely freaking everything, you can get anti-bias training anytime you want for just about anything. And so that's something that we can make generally available to both people in those domestic violence shelters and hopefully to law enforcement as well. This is part of what we're trying to do. We're trying to change the landscape in America where people can look to law enforcement for equal treatment. And a lot of that is reducing unconscious bias. And so I think that we're just seeing more and more discussion about this. We should take advantage of it. We should run with it. But that's just, that's just me.
Someone's hand had been up on the participant list, so I'm crossing my fingers and hoping that if they feel comfortable to come off mute and ask their question or send it in the chat, I'll give them a minute to do so if they're cozy.
Well, one thing that we could potentially do, and something that we need to investigate, I believe, in my personal opinion, as a member of the LGBTQ community, I had an experience of basically domestic violence and coming back from California in a shambles kind of situation, and I sought help and was had the door slammed in my face locally because they said you've got what's coming to you. I basically had all kinds of people say basically you deserve it, and had no help at all, even friends and things like that. It was awful. Now I don't want to continue with that, so something that I really believe that is necessary at this point, and I still feel drawn to this being something we do locally, but the fact of the matter is, we need an LGBTQ plus center in Cookeville, and I worked at the one out in Los Angeles and worked in the Orange County, California one for years, and worked in their children's facility helping the kids. And, I'm sorry to say, but locally here, when things like that happen, there is still a view that, we are to be punished for what we are doing. And I've never seen such heartlessness like that, which I thought, wait a minute, these are, good, they claim to be nice Christian people or whatever. And I was like, what in the world? So to me, I'm like, let's just take that, and rather than be angry about it and hurt and everything else, say, let's be empowered. But, it's coming to where that we need to have a facility or some place that we can go to have, group meetings and different things, and be able to have resources where the next person that comes through town that needs help won't be, have the door slammed in their face by people that are supposed to help them. So, and obviously the tech resources are absolutely phenomenal, and we are so grateful for that. And that was many years ago, but, times they are changing, but it's something that it would be a really great part of Cookeville if we could have that as a resource.
Yeah, and I think just our local organizing, like there's so much you can do to locally organize and as well as nationally organize, whether you want to take advantage of an existing group and work with changing that group or adding to that group, or if alternatively you want to sort of start your own initiative. Yeah, I don't understand how retired people get bored. I really don't get it. There's so much to do. We have so much work to do. There's so many volunteering opportunities out there. And if one organization just doesn't seem like a good fit for you, like if you're too scrappy for Moms Demand Action, or you're too interested in this other side issue for, then just join that group, man. Just make a difference however you can. Find your passion and whatever you're a survivor of. And I think we're a nation of survivors. it's I think an important journey that you can take as to heal. So it's very disappointing what Suzanne described. I wish I could say it was surprising, but I really think that these local organizations, like, there's nothing wrong with calling them and say, I have an LGBTQ person that I know that's in trouble. I want to know that they're going to be treated well there. What are you doing to make sure that happens? Those are good questions. Those are good questions to ask, and to join local communities, local organizations, to make sure that understanding issues of domestic violence is on their agenda. And this is why Moms Demand Action shows up at the Pride Festival in Cookeville every year, because it's an intersecting issue. It's an intersecting issue, and so we show up every year to make sure that people know that we're part of the conversation and we're trying to be part of the solution.
We're just too fabulous for one organization, Amanda.
Oh, yes.
All right. Okay, another question that was sent, and it was, so circling back to the internet and gun show exemptions and how folks they can get around that background check.
Yeah.
Person's wondering why you think that is. Like, what motivation would there be to not have that be the law of universal background checks? Why are some folks against responsible gun ownership?
Ew.
It's hard to think about something you don't believe in, probably.
It's hard. I think that there's a culture of the slippery slope. There's a little bit of that going on. So I think that one of the things that the NRA and other gun lobby has been very, very successful at is the notion of any legislative action about gun ownership is anti-gun, is anti-gun ownership. They're going to come take your guns. And so they basically create a narrative of fear and of paranoia. And it really just sort of shuts down the discussion. It just shuts it down. I've gotten to the point now where I recognize that conversation almost immediately. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm not getting anywhere with this. But for the most part, people are willing to say, I don't want dangerous people running around with firearms. So if we can generally agree on that premise, then we can talk about how to get there. And we can talk about how to get there in a civilized, with civilized discourse. And I just think that there's some people who have a vested interest and who make money from us not having a civilized discourse. And the money they make is with paranoia and fear. We see that gun sales go up every time there's an attitude of paranoia and fear and mass gun confiscation, all that sort of thing. I mean, that makes money. That's some serious dollars behind that. And so we have to really counter that with our own narrative. And make sure that we, just stick to the facts, stick to the data, make our agenda as clear as we possibly can, which is not, again, about ending gun ownership in the United States. That is not the goal of Moms Demand Action, and I wouldn't support it if it were. I work with fisheries and wildlife, and I probably shouldn't mention that because, my job is on the side here. But, a big part of fisheries and wildlife conservation is the hunting community and the harvesting community, and I don't want them going anywhere. And I wouldn't work with Moms Demand Action if I thought it would affect them negatively. So it's really important for me to make it very, very clear that that's not what we're about, and just keep hammering away at it. And we just have to be as relentless and as noisy and as determined as the NRA is. And that's pretty freaking determined, and that's pretty, pretty relentless. And hopefully that 10% of the American public that's against universal background sales will not hold the conversation hostage anymore. It's only 10%. And they're holding the conversation hostage. We just can't allow that anymore. And when you educate yourself and you work with Moms Demand Action and you do all this stuff, then you can just have those conversations with people. You can say, yep, that's not true. Nope, facts don't show that. Here's some data. And it doesn't necessarily change any minds, but it gives you very, very firm ground to stand on, and also just keeps you level, keeps you from losing your temper, mostly. I had to wait 25 years to have these discussions. It was very hard for me to be level at first. because, you know, I just went straight from 0 to 10 because you're talking about my friend, you're talking about my teacher, like back off, you know. And now I realize that it's a much larger issue than that. It's not about me anymore, and I can be a lot more level.
Are there any other folks that have questions or have more things to contribute to this discussion? I have been so impressed with this discussion and the questions that have already been posed. I feel like Amanda is really, we're making her work and asking some really tough and yet very important questions. And so I want to give an opportunity if anyone's been kind of holding back and thinking, oh, I don't know if I want to ask. Now is your chance. We would love to hear your questions, your discussion, your thoughts before we wrap up for the evening together.
There's also a wonderful video. I'll have to see if I can find it, but it's called Turkey Talk, Guns Turkey Talk. So if you're home with your gun toting uncle and he's talking about those crazy moms demand action, want to come get my guns, you know, or whatever it is, and you want to say, well, actually, I don't think that's what they're all about. You know, it can give you some resources and some things to talk about to try to basically take those myths and turn them around. Those myths are very, very much out there. They're very much alive, and it's important that we counter them, and we counter them with gentle discussion. I don't think that by yelling and screaming, we're going to get anywhere with this, as tempting as it might be.
So I had a question about Moms Demand Action specifically.
Sure.
So my high school had a bomb threat when I was there, like freshman or sophomore year, and I didn't know if there was anything like overreaching that could be done about that because with it specifically involving schools, I didn't know if it was just focused on gun violence or other versions, like other threats to children in schools and trying to learn as well.
I think a lot of our initiatives are sort of centered around gun violence, but that could have far-reaching effects. We have a Students Demand Action chapter. A lot of the Students Demand Action chapters will partner with, with groups that, community groups that are about reducing gun violence or reducing violence in communities in general. So those partnerships can be a really important part of addressing larger issues. So for example, city gun violence is one of the big things that we're working with. So we work with Project Peace, we work with just different community organizations that work in cities to improve basically discussions and the ability of people to peacefully resolve conflict. And so gun violence is a big part of that organization. So moms will partner with those organizations as part of their initiatives. So no, I'm not sure that Moms Demand Action alone is going to deal with all this stuff and it's going to handle all this stuff, but they can partner and use their power, their legislative power, their group of volunteers to partner with organizations that in general just bring the tension and fear down on schools, because we know that learning and fear do not work well together. They don't work well together. And if you're under bomb threats or mass shooting threats or whatever it might happen to be, it's terrifying. And we also just, have general, red flag laws and things like that can apply to a variety of other dangerous circumstances. So, I do think that they will act to protect students in general. But I think that's where the partnerships come in. And I would encourage you that if you're just interested in starting a Students Demand Action chapter, we could use one around here. I know we've got some Students Demand Action volunteers, but I'd love to see a more active chapter in Cookeville. And I'm sorry you went through that. That's terrifying. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Amanda, could you speak to the about the Say Something app too? That I started thinking about that when Amber brought that up.
Honestly, Erin, you might know more about it than I do.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, if you see something, say something, and basically in schools, yeah. I mean, if you see somebody making a threat, you let law enforcement know immediately so that people can do something about it, basically.
Yeah, I had actually talked to the local school district at one point, but it's an app, it's a whole system that a school district, or I would imagine a college campus as well, can do, where everybody who wants to can download the Say Something app on their phone, and you can anonymously report if you have information on, you hear another student talking about threats, whether it be gun violence or some other kind of violence, you can anonymously send a text through your Say Something app that I heard this and give all the information about it, and then local police will investigate. When that question came up, it just made me think about that.
And Amber, you should know that school safety was the #1 motivator of Moms Demand Action when it began. And it's expanded since then to include all sorts of gun violence. And we've followed the data and followed the information in terms of where gun violence is the worst, where it takes the most lives, where we need to do the most work. But honestly, we do this to protect our kids.
Yeah, thank you for the information. That app also would have been very helpful, because I overheard another student once, and I was scared to go tell somebody because I was worried that if he felt confident enough to threaten, that he could have also figured out, oh, well, who ratted me out, and then, subsequently come find whoever it was. And I was like, yeah, I don't know about that. So that would have been really helpful. And I after multiple incidents at the high school I graduated from, we had a on-campus protest, actually specifically about gun violence. And I was part of that, and I did some research, and I've been on the Moms Demand Action in Every Town text thing for a few years now. So
Awesome.
It's been a journey.
Thank you. Yeah, they do text you a lot. I put them on silent, and I check them once a day, just so you know. Even I, who am wearing the t-shirt, go, okay, guys, I'm teaching class right now. I'm putting you on silent. They're very active. But that means that there's a lot that you can do. There's, you can be involved just a little, or involved, you can completely immerse yourself. However, you can really set it. And, you should know that when I called the tech police to ask them questions specifically, I had to keep re-explaining to them, nothing's wrong. I'm fine. They're like, are you in danger? No, I'm asking if this happens, if how you would handle it. And it was pretty, there was clearly concern, so that I appreciated that. But I was like, no, I'm fine. I deliberately started every conversation. This isn't a non-emergency situation, and I'm asking you this question. But yeah, that did give me, I don't know how effective they are, to be honest, and I hope that we never have to test them.
I have another question.
Yes,
so if we know someone that is in a violent relationship, and we know that their abuser does have a gun in the house, what is your advice for like helping them leave? Because that situation would look different if we know that they don't have a weapon. So like a safety plan would look different in these situations. So I'm wondering if you have advice for people who are in that situation.
I am hesitant to give you direct advice, only because I'm not an expert in this situation. I'm an expert in the legislation and in the statistics. I would definitely call the hotline. They would know exactly what questions to ask. They would know all about getting you a safety plan out of there. They would know exactly which law enforcement to contact. So my advice to you is call that hotline, get that information, tell them everything that you can, and they should be able to give you really, really good advice based on actual data information on how to improve the safety of the people there. So that's definitely, I'm so sorry. You must be worried to death. It's a scary situation when that happens. But there are resources available out there. Use them. Use them to the maximum. If it doesn't work the first time, try again. Be determined. Don't let somebody turn you away. And I think that's going to be really important too. That's also the case with any volunteer situation, you guys. Every organization that we work with is a human organization with human problems and human foibles. If you allow yourself to get turned away the first time, it doesn't work out exactly the way you want it to, then you're not going to be able to see it through, because it's going to always not be perfect, because it's going to be run by people. So just keep at it, be determined, see the long game and play it. And that long game for your friend is survival right now. So get out of that situation, fast, would be my advice. But get the experts to really weigh in on that.
Yeah, great question. At Tech as well, there's the hotline resource, and of course, Project Awaken is available to help safety plan for you and that friend as well. We have one other question, Amanda, that was messaged to me, and that is, what intersectionality do we see with race and ethnicity and domestic violence and gun violence? So for example, they say, are groups more likely to experience gun violence?
Absolutely. Okay. The statistics are really, really sad. It is, let's see. I want to make sure to get you the right statistics. Black American, Indian, Alaska Native, and Hispanic women are victims of homicide at the highest rates. And over 55% of the killings of these women are committed by an intimate partner. And more than half of those deaths, firearm is involved. Black women are twice as likely to be fatally shot by an intimate partner compared to white women. Younger Black women between the ages of 18 and 34 are nearly 3 times more likely to be shot and killed by an intimate partner than are white women in the same age group. More than half of American Indian Alaska Native women have experienced physical violence by intimate partners in their lifetime. So any structural disadvantages, what we're seeing with COVID, what we're seeing with any of our societal blights, we see that they are disproportionately felt by our minority communities. And so any community with a history of discrimination, any community with high poverty rates, any community with limited access to services, any community with a lack of a trust in the criminal justice systems, that has poorly resourced schools, housing, and healthcare, is going to experience disproportionately high rates of gun violence. That is what we find over and over and over again. If those communities are associated with the color of your skin, then by all means that is seen, and that is seen at a national level. For our local community here in Tennessee, that also means our Appalachian communities and our historically impoverished communities in Western Virginia and in Eastern Tennessee. So, this is definitely a minority issue by all means. It's a huge minority issue, and it's something that we really need to work on at a national level. And it is something we are working on. I think Moms Demand Action has a bit of a rep of being a bunch of white suburban ladies yelling about guns. And to some extent, yeah, sure, there's quite a few of us. But we are also seeing a lot of initiatives that just pretty much span the gamut of the entire American public. And there's a lot of initiatives and work going on now in American cities. And we're really, this year seems to be the year where we're really trying to expand into rural communities as well. So we're pretty much trying to, gun violence is epidemic in this country. It's epidemic, and it's epidemic everywhere. And it's a whole issue. It's something that we're gonna all have to work on together. There's no question in my mind, and there's no question in the data, that it disproportionately affects communities of color in this nation, which is unacceptable.
Great questions from everyone. Is there any other questions that folks have?
I would just like to thank you for your time and sharing this information. It's been very insightful. And if I could trouble you for the text number again, I would be interested in that.
Okay, it's 64433.
Okay, thank you.
And I pretty much think you could text just about anything to that number and they'd be like, hey, welcome to Moms Demand Action. But If you want to let them know that a survivor fellow is the one who gave you that number, then the word that you text them is honor, HONOR, and it honors the people that we have lost to gun violence.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for your dedication to this and
Thank
and
you.
sharing your story. It's very brave of you. And to anyone who's been negatively impacted and hurt, my heart goes out to you, and I'm so sorry. No one deserves to be treated like that. And I think together we can all try to help to make a difference. So thank you for sharing this.
Thank you, Mary.
I love seeing everyone's folks sending those clap emojis on Zoom and sending love. I can feel it. I know a lot of times when we're in a room together, we have that privilege of creating that safe and warm environment. And it's really powerful that even through Zoom, Amanda has created that with all of us this evening.
Oh, and my dog is joining the game.
For the love. That's only right? That dogs want to come and feel in that moment too.
I think she wants treats, but I'll say she's just joining the room. Oh yeah, use those better.
Amanda,
you might get it.
Thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts for taking time to do this.
Welcome.
So grateful to have your expertise and for you to share your story and what we can all do to be a part of this solution. So if you can send clap hands for Amanda, please do.
Thanks, guys. I am available for any questions. If you have any questions about Moms Demand Action, gun violence, any of that stuff. If there's a situation where sharing a story and putting a human face on the gun violence epidemic would be of assistance to you, let me know. That's what I do. That's what Survivor Fellows do, is we share our stories. So I'm happy to do it when it's appropriate to do so.
Wonderful. Amanda, is it appropriate for them, if they want to get in contact with you, that they could email us and we'll connect them with you? Or do you want to put your email? It's your call either way.
Perfect. Yeah, I think the easiest thing for a tech community is arosenberger@tintech.edu, or you can just Google me. It's not that hard to find me. Rosenbergers aren't super common. I don't know. It's a married name, but I'm the only Rosenberger on campus. So you can find me that way, but it's arosenberger@tintech.edu.
Wonderful.
But obviously, I am not speaking for Tennessee Tech, nor am I speaking just as a volunteer today.
We're so grateful for all of you to come to and spend time. We can't fix an issue that we cannot see. And so it's really important that we're all here learning and asking these questions. I encourage you to stick with Project Awaken. We have another event tomorrow that I think is a really good follow-up to this. It's a guided meditation at 1 p.m. I was just listening to a podcast earlier today about how stress manifests in our body and how even if the stressor is gone, like talking about the heavy, hard thing, that stress is still in your body. And how one of the most important ways to get that stress out of your body is breathing and moving your body. And so I encourage each of you this evening to carve out a little time to take care of yourself, whether that means going for a walk, whether it means taking some time to do a 30-second dance party, whatever that looks like for you to kind of shake it off, because this kind of stuff, it's important, but it is so heavy. So please take time to care for yourself. And if caring for yourself looks like joining us tomorrow, we would love to have you.
I'd like to add one thing.
Yeah, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. If you are a survivor of gun violence, and 60% of the American public has been affected by gun violence in some way, shape, or form, so I have no doubt that somebody in this room is, you can text Survivor to 64433 and connect to Survivor resources at Everytown for Gun Safety, which includes wonderful resources for self-care. You have access to free online mental health care. There's all sorts of things that they do for survivor volunteers to help us care for ourselves as we go through this journey. So if you are a survivor and you're just not real sure you're ready, but you think you could be ready with resources and with backup, I encourage you to check it out. And check out the Everytown Survivor Network, which is a wonderful network of survivors. It has enlarged my life tremendously and made this journey much easier.
Wonderful. I'm going to put this in the chat for tomorrow too. I'm going to stick around for a second, and I'm sure Amanda might be willing to as well, so that as folks are leaving, if you need help getting connected to a resource, I know this might bring up stuff for folks, so if you need help getting connected to resources that can help you right now, we're happy to stick around and do that. But again, thank you so much for everyone who's come. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording so that if there are folks needing that resource, you know that it will not be recorded. But